Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Machine Dana and today I'm going to be going through another Factorio tutorial. In this tutorial I'm going to be going through belt balancers, how they work, the applications you can use them for, why they're useful, a little bit about designing your own. I'll also go through some information about the blueprints that I particularly use. I will put a string link in the description to the blueprint book that I use so that you can get access to all of the blueprints that I use for my belt balancers. But I'll also look at some interesting balancers across the internet as well. So hopefully you find this a useful video for belt balancers. I've done quite a few train tutorials and things like that and base tours, and I've had a couple of different people ask me about belt balancers, so I thought it would be quite a nice idea to give my own perspective on belt balancers. I've only got probably like 1,000 or 1,200 hours in Factorio, which it's quite a lot, but it's not like some people have like 10,000 hours in Factorio, so I'm quite an expert, but I'm not like a super expert on it. So hopefully I can impart some knowledge that I do have, but please by all means ferret around for more information about belt balancers as well, because there's no one right way to do things in this game in Factorio, as you probably already know. So if you're enjoying the content I'm putting out on YouTube, and in particular if you find this video useful, please do thumbs up the video, and if you want to see more, please subscribe on the subscribe button. So without further ado, I'll switch to full screen mode and we'll get into it. Okay, so this is my base. First and foremost, I do use quite a lot of mods in the current playthrough that I'm using. So if you see any weird colours or weird products or anything like that, then it's more than likely not your eyes deceiving you. There's a pretty good chance it's just a mod that I'm using, and I've also done a separate video on the mods that I do use, so I'll link that in the description too, so you can have a quick look at that. Obviously I'm going to be focusing on belt balancers in particular in this video, so I'm going to first go into how belt balancers work. So to get a good idea of how belt balancers work, probably the best thing to do is actually let's just start with the basics. Belt balancers, in essence, what they will do is, if I put some product into here, let's say some rail lines, is typical stuff. Splitters in themselves will balance product equally across two belts, and in among itself, that is pretty useful for pulling products off, but maintaining a throughput of products elsewhere as well. There's quite a lot of nuance that can come with just a simple and basic splitter. Now, back in the day, a couple of years ago, they didn't used to have input priorities and output priorities on the splitters, and they didn't used to have filters on the splitters. So there's now a lot more flexibility built into the splitters. Some of the balancing and content that's out there at the moment is still useful, but not as relevant as it previously was because of some of the updates that have happened in the last year or so. So very basically, the settings on a splitter, you've got the input priority, which determines, let's say, if there are two inputs into this, if there were two inputs to this. Let's say there were two inputs to this. Setting the input priority, let's say in this instance the left, will mean that it will try and use, this splitter will try and use the product from that particular belt there before it then tries to use this one. And when there's no product left on there, or it chokes up here, it will try and use from the other side. You can swap that around, obviously. Then you've got output priority. This says, look, I don't care which side it's coming from. I will try to take equally from both sides, unless only one side is feeding it. But I will always try and output first to, in this case, the left side. So the output priority on the left. So they're the basics of the splitters, and that works pretty well. Let's get into a little bit of detail about actually balancing across multiple belts for a quick second. So I'm going to switch my monitor now to monitor mode so I can get some internet work on there. Best way of explaining this, to be honest, is in the diagrams I've already seen online. They will explain it way better than I can, but obviously to digest it in this video, I'll go into it. So I'll link this in the description, but it's wiki.factorio.com/balancer mechanics. And essentially what we're talking about, it's these two images on the right hand side here. We're talking about throughput quantity, and we're also then talking about balancing across multiple belts. So it's not just the quantity of product that's going onto a line, but it's also having quantity from each line that's balanced across multiple lines. So almost like the origin of a product, if you think of it like the origin of the product. So to explain this, if we've got one line coming into a splitter, it will split it 50-50. If you've then, in this example, if you've got splitters coming off those, it will split them into a quarter each, or 0.25 as decimal. So that's talking about ratios, but also you've got to talk and think about origins as well. Origins, in this, you're more often than not going to be balancing one product across, multiple belts. It's not going to be often you're going to be balancing multiple products across multiple belts. You generally tend to keep them apart, but there's nothing from stopping you from doing that, particularly with the filter function that I showed. Did I show it? Yeah, I think I briefly showed the filter function. So talking about origins, if you've got a splitter, on this particular example here, if you've got a splitter that's got an A and B product, they could be, in theory, two different products, but more than likely it's going to be one product. But they could be coming in on different quantities. So, of course, you've got the throughput, potentially a maximum throughput of one full belt on each side. And this splitter can output a maximum of two quantities of two full belt quantities. So this output will be an AB output because it's got an AB input, but it will be across both lines, an equal split across both lines. Same here, CD. So if you're then going to split the ABs across the CDs, you then need another splitter for those two, which is what happens here. And also again here. So first, this splits the C and D across the two separate belts to merge those. And this belt here will then merge to an ABCD because it's also got an input of this line here. So hopefully that makes pretty good sense. So you're left with a situation where you've got ABCD products of origin. So belts from, this is balanced from 4 different origin belts or input belts. Hopefully that's an explanation that works to a reasonable degree. So back into application mode. It's important to think about when you're balancing belts. It's important to think about the way you balance on a single belt, and also then you balance how you balance across multiple belts. So balancing belts among themselves, and then as an extension to that, actually how you're using those balances and what the reason for having those balances is as well. So I'll just go onto my belt balancing notepad again. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about balancing across a single belt. You're almost always going to want to balance across a single belt to start with. And I'll show an example here. This is just a basic application, which I'll go into a bit of detail later. But balancing to condense a single belt is quite important because it gives you your maximum throughput, knowing that both sides of the belts are being fully condensed. So how do you do that? The most basic balancing that you can do in the game is to balance a single belt, literally a single belt. Now, the way I normally do it is just like that. This belt output will be fully balanced. The reason for that is whether it's one input that's coming in there or if you've got 2 inputs, it doesn't really matter. But whatever the inputs are, because I've not changed any of the settings here to output a priority of left or right or put a filter on it, this will output half of the product along there to this right side of the belt, and it will output half of this product here straight onto the left side of the belt. And what that just means is this is a fully condensed belt. That's probably the single most important principle of belt balancing, to actually balance the belts first before you then balance the belts across each other. I think this is called lane balancing. You might hear it referred to as lane balancing. Another way of doing this is, if you want to just kind of go straight forward, is kind of like that. This is one that I used to use quite a lot as well. So if you're kind of just going up straight off in a direction, whereas if you're coming off at an angle, then this right angle one can work pretty well. So that works pretty well to balance the actual single belt. And you may have, maybe the case that you have multiple versions of these and they serve as the inputs to your, let me just show you an example of this, to your eventual belt balancer, which might be here. So if you want 2 inputs, you want to make sure that both of the belts themselves are fully condensed. The reason that's important is because now there is an absolute maximum capacity that you're giving that. You're giving it its most potential. Whereas if you don't do that, and I'll probably illustrate an example of that quite obviously here. If you don't do that, you're not actually giving your outputs its chance to be at its maximum capacity. So, and you'll see only one side of, and even when I put more more railing, those two belts are not at their maximum capacity. So you've essentially outputted only one amount of product, one lane's worth of product across those two lanes. Now, as it happens, you've only got one lane input here, but even if you had a second lane input, a second lane input of the same product will yield the exact same issue. So theoretically, you can have two full lanes of inputs and two full lanes of outputs, but because you're not balancing the outputs are only balancing equivalent of one belt's worth. So to be honest, you might as well, in this example, if you only want a one full condensed belt output, you'd be better off actually doing that. Because the output of that example here is exactly the same as the example before. A single belt is just on one belt rather than across two belts. Hopefully that makes good sense. So that's single belt balancing. It's really, really important to balance the single belt, particularly if throughput of product is important to the factory that you're making. If the throughput of the product is less important and all you're wanting is purely just to balance product across multiple lanes or whatever, then that's probably going to be less of a problem. But those instances are quite rare in Factorio, I would say. So it's good to get into the habit of balancing across a single lane. So what I'm now going to quickly do, I did say I would sort of offer my belt balancing book. I can't even remember where I originally got this from, but there are other people that can credit for these, and I'll show some of those later on in the video. I'm just going to do a very slow scroll through of my belts, my belt balancers, and this is so that anyone watches the video that doesn't want to download the blueprint, they can just pause the video at a point in time, and they can just literally trace the belt balancer. Now, when you've got the blueprint book itself in your hand in Factorio, you can hold shift down in Windows and literally scroll with your mouse while you're in the book, and that'll let you scroll through. So I'll just do a slow scroll through so that somebody can trace if needed. I should probably zoom in a little bit as well, maybe there. So I'll just quickly do this. So it's a 2 to 3 wide variant, 2 to 4, a 2 to 5, 2 to 5 with a wide variant, a 2 to 6, 2 to 7, a 2 to 8 balancer, a 3 to 2, 3 to 3, 3 to 4, 3 to 5, 3 to 6. I'll just shut up now because you can see the numbers on there. Might want to scroll through this if you're not interested in seeing every single belt balancer. I'm only going up to 8 to 8 here, by the way, because for me I found that so far to cover all of my needs. But when you get to sort of mega base size, you may well need to think about bigger belt balancers. But you can always double up the belt balancers and then split them across each other. So, and that's it. 8 to 8 is the last one I've got. So that's the scroll through of them done. I've talked a little about single belt condensing. I can't stress enough how important that is. And now balancing across multiple belts. So, first of all, I'm not going to go into the actual specific designing of belts here because there are so many blueprints out there where you can just pick them up and they just work. In this video, I'm more concerned with the reasons for the belt balancing and how you apply that within your factory and why it's important and do's and don'ts and limitations and things like that. So there's simply no point in me going into the detail about how to belt balance because there are so many blueprints out there. I might do another video on that at a later point in time, but at the header of this video where I talked about the ABCDs, that's essentially what you're looking at really. It's applying the ABCD and the ratio principles onto the belt balancer. So let's just quickly test these belt balancers that I've got here. I've got here this is a 3 to 2 belt balancer from the blueprint book, and this is a 3 to 6 belt balancer. They're just two examples. The way you test a belt balancer is to have the grabbers or the inserters. I got told off for calling them grabbers in a recent video by someone. So let me see. So let's just put the grabbers there, the inserters there and there. Okay. So now all we want to do is it doesn't, bear in mind with balancers, the inputs are less important than the outputs. It's the outputs that we're trying to balance, not the inputs. So if you've got fully condensed lines going in and some lines that are not fully condensed, that's almost less important than the fact that the output lines are balanced across each other. And that is the essence and the point of a belt balancer. Now, the maximum thing to bear in mind is the maximum amount of output that you can get from a belt balancer is its input. So if I'm putting 3 belts worth of product, the absolute maximum product I can get out the back end of this, even though there are 6 lanes, is 3 lanes worth of outputs. So they may be spread across 6 lanes, but the actual amount of product is the equivalent of 3 lanes worth in this particular example. So the inputs dictate the volume of the products, and the outputs determine the balancing of the products across the different lines in the belt balancer. Hopefully that makes sense. So the way you test it is you can set it, if you're designing your own, you literally just set up the boxes, place in some product. Again, it doesn't really matter about the speed at which the inputs go. What matters is the quantities that are in these boxes at the end, and ideally they're going to be, if the belt balancer is working properly, they will be very similar or exactly the same as each other depending on the ratios and the amount of product that you put in there. So I'm just going to fill these up. I put 300, I don't even know how much I put in there, to be honest. Put just shy of 300, I think, in there. So we'll let them work their magic. Okay, that was quite quick. Alt. So I've got 46 in there, 46, 46. If you look on the right-hand side over here, you'll see the number. 46, 46, 46. I can see that belt balancer is working pretty well. And I could add more product to that just to test it if you weren't fully confident. We'll do the same again here, just to test this one. We'll let them do their job. And what I'm doing here is essentially when the ratios are going from a higher number to a lower number, you are condensing the quantity of product onto a lower amount of lines of belts. There are a number of reasons why you might do that. It might just be that you only need a certain output quantity. You might only need, in this example, you may only need 2 outputs. It purely might be a need thing, but sometimes you would balance the belts for the purposes of condensing down. Now, let's say, for example, you've got 4 or 5 belts that are, let's say you've got 5 belts that are not very densely packed in among themselves. Now you may still balance them to each other so that they are equally balanced across the 2 sides of the belt. That still doesn't necessarily mean that belt is fully condensed to its maximum capacity, because simply your production may not allow for that. You may not have enough production to stuff that belt full. So it sometimes can make sense to say, well, I know I'm not going to have production to this amount of belts quantities, so why don't I condense down the number of belts that are being used as the output to a lower amount, but have them more condensed. So when you've got an instance like this where you've got 3 inputs and 2 outputs where you're downscaling the ratios, you're generally doing it to either because the need is only what you're outputting. You simply only need, let's say in this example, 2 belts worth, or it could be that you're literally trying to condense the product of 3 belt inputs to 2 belts. So you may not quite be producing enough to output 3 full belts. So in this case, it makes good rationale here to condense down to 2 belts, because actually you're then only transporting 2 belts worth. So it's a more efficient way of transporting product away around your base if you know that you're not going to need more than that. But also the other thing as well, the thing to bear in mind with belt balancers is they're not permanent. You can rip them up, and if at a later stage you're producing a lot more product, and for instance in this example, you may double your quantity of production at a later stage, you might want to do a 6 to a 4 balancer, and that's just an quick easy upgrade when you've got the blueprint available. So I would encourage you to either trace the blueprints that I'm using here that I showed earlier, or to download the string of blueprint books book that I put in the description below. So let's just have a quick look at this. I don't know how much we put in, but that's balanced 138 to 136. There's 2 of them still in there that I think would have filled in the gap, so I'm pretty comfortable that belt balancer is working really well. So that's how you test the belt balancers, and there's an example of kind of condensing down. Now in situations where you're scaling up, so your ratios are going from a low to a higher number, you're normally doing that because literally just because of an efficiency of moving product. So a really good application of this would be if you're producing 2 lanes worth of product, but you've got 3 loading bays on a rail station. So what you don't want to do is feed in 2 belts worth of product across 2 of those loading bays into 2 cargo trucks, and have the 3rd cargo truck in your rail network if you've got a 3 cargo truck rail network. Essentially redundant. So you want to be able to spread the product across all 3, but you also, by spreading 2 lanes of 2 belts worth of product across 3 cargo wagon loading stations or bays, as it were, you're speeding up the process because you've got 3 bays that are working to load rather than 2. So it's not only does it speed it up, but it allows for 3 to be used. So that's an example where it can be used. Now I'll actually show that as an application. So this is my base here. I'll do a base tour separately, so you may want to look at that video. But this is essentially my liquid bus line here and my physical product bus line loading base. So these are my rails. Now, the way I do my train network at the moment is a 1-3. So I've got 1 locomotive and 3 cargo wagons. So for products where I only want to have 2 belt outputs or 3 belt outputs or something like that, what I do is I have one side of the train station unloading. I first balance the output across to a single belt. So these 6 inserters here are placing onto these belts that then condense from a 2 into a single belt, which basically guarantees that this is going to be fully condensed, providing there's enough product being inputted into that. And the chests are acting here as a buffer. So I'm first balancing across the single belt in itself, but then I want to balance across the multiple belts here. So I've used a 3 to a 2 balancer. And that's purely because I only need, in this case, this is Bob's Mods like silicon plates. I only need 2 belts worth of outputs. So I've then condensed the 3 outputs, but so these locomotives can output a maximum of 3 full belts worth of product out onto these belts into the factory, onto the bus line. But I only need 2, but I don't want one of these to be redundant, so I might as well basically have all 3 working at the same time. And it just means that this is being, relatively speaking, unloaded at there are some limitations which I'll explain later, but relatively speaking, this train's being fully utilised, and it should increase the speed at which this belt fills up. It matters more as well when you've got slower inserters earlier on in the game too, because if you've got more inputs, they've got more inserters working to fill the same number of belts essentially, so it can speed things up. And as you can see here, I've then fed this product onto my bus line. My bus line, I've just chosen to do bus lines that are 4 deep and then 4 spaces, and at a later point in time I'll be able to fill these spaces as well. Another example though of where it becomes a little bit more kind of nuanced. Now, with iron plates, I want an even quicker way of unloading that train. I want an even higher throughput. So this train here, I've put both sides of the train to be unloaded. So I've got, again, every single side has got the belt itself being balanced across itself to fully condense it, and also to balance the product across both sides. So you've got 6 of these single belt balancers. Ignore this little error down here. People might have spotted it. That's just a space issue that I had. So ignore that. I'll just move it up there so it's out of the way. So what I've done here is I've balanced across the 3. This is a 3 belt balancer to 2. I've done the same down here. So I've balanced single belts, a 3 inputs to 2 outputs. And then those 2 outputs I've balanced across each other to a 4 to 4 output. And what that gives me is 6 belts of inputs to essentially make 4 belts of solid iron outputs. So I'm condensing down at a 6 to 4 ratio, but I'm doing it in a way that's like a 3 to 2, which then is duplicated. So that's the way belt balancers work. You can combine them to get higher throughputs or a quicker way of condensing things. But what this means is you've got, instead of 6, 6 and 6, so 18 inserters unloading that, I've actually got twice the amount. So I've got, what's that, 18, 36. I've got 36 inserters that are unloading this this train. So it means that if I've got a really high usage of iron in my factory at a particular time, I can have more trains coming in here and therefore a higher throughput. Well, what this also does is it means that single station there, I can also expand this by another 2 lanes of outputs, meaning I could change this to a, instead of balancing from a 3 to a 2, I could just have a 3 to 3 balancer and a 3 to 3 balancer here, and then the 3s I can combine into a 6 to 6 output and have 6 outputs and 6 lanes of iron. And I could then have more versions of that iron to have then 12 lanes of iron. So you can duplicate things up. Another way of me doing that would be to have 6 cargo wagons instead, and then have a 6 to 6 on either side, and then have basically a 12 to 12 balancer onto the bus line. So that's the application of it onto coming off the bus lanes, but hopefully that gives a flavour of how belt balancers tend to be used in the factory. So I'll just show a couple of other utilizations. It's probably quite a good example, I would say. Well, yeah, maybe this one. So, by the way, I'm really liking the new drills. Can't see these ones in motion, but they're pretty cool. So, when you're actually mining, this is tin ore that I'm mining here. Again, it's a Bob's Mods, Bob's Ores, I think it is. I've basically, purely due to the size of this patch, I've got 5 outputs. I have 5 belts of outputs, and because the mining efficiency and various other things, I know that those belts, whilst the patch is big enough, is going to output a full density on both sides. So generally, this is always going to be balanced anyway, but as this top of the patch starts to run low, you may find that this top section here is not putting enough onto this top half of the belt, in which case you almost need the bottom half of the belt to keep the throughput up on that single belt line. This belt balancer does that. That's what it achieves. So you've got half the product that go on this side and half that will go onto this side. You've got a single belt there that is fully balanced. I've done that across all 5, and again, there's only 5 purely because that was just the size of the patch. So we're now in a situation where naturally I've got 5 fully balanced, kind of fully condensed pieces of ore with the belts coming out of that. So our input ratios are 5 here, but I've decided to go with a loading bay of 6 loading stations. So there's going to be 1, 2, 3 cargo wagons, and there are essentially 6 loading bays to those 3 cargo wagons. Again, you've got 36 inserters loading that up. This one here is annoying me. I've not put a filter on that, so that's not going to work. I need to fix that. So I've actually got 35 inserters loading this particular station, but that's only through stupidity. So what we've done here is we've balanced 5 products, 5 inputs across 6 outputs. So the maximum output here is only going to be 5 products worth of product. But it's balanced across 6 lanes purely for the sake of allowing 6 loading bays in this case to load it. Now, if I was loading, let's say this station, which has only got 3 loading bays for the same 3 cargo wagons, so that'll load at half the speed of this one, assuming the inserters are the same, which they're actually not. They're red ones, which is an older one. This one will be faster, but assuming the inserters are the same and all the other facts are the same, this will load at half the speed of that train station. If I wanted this ore to go into that station, 6 outputs isn't going to work. It could theoretically work because I could have 2 full inputs into this splitter, meaning there'd be 2 full outputs there, but it doesn't increase the speed of there and the speed of the loading in any real way, and I don't think that'll benefit me. So what I could do in that situation is balance the 5 down to a 3. So I'd use a 5 to 3 balancer on the blueprint book. Hold shift, scroll down. Literally going down to a 5 to 3, set it to the right size, and that would give me the 3 outputs. In this case, that would fit for these, and that's precisely what I've done here. I've got a 5 going to a 5 to a 3. So that's using it on all patches. There are some other applications as well, which I'll quickly go through. Sometimes you'll make products and you need to balance across belts purely to allow the production process to continue. Now, in this case, again, it's Bob's Mods, so this is one of the chip types. In this case, it's the basic circuit boards. This takes wood, it takes some copper wire, and it turns them into basic circuit boards. Now, what I've done in this particular factory is I've allowed space on both. I say space, I've actually used some of that space up here, but I can move these inserter factories. So I've allowed space to increase the size of that factory north and also to the east. Now, there are a couple of different ways I could do that. I can also add modules and beacons and efficiency and stuff like that on these factories. So I always design my factory with that in mind. But now, as it happens, these particular chips are backed up. But if they weren't backed up, you'd see that I'm balancing these in a particular way within the belt itself. So I'm not pre-balancing per se. I'm balancing it as part of almost the production process. So here, just to explain what's going on here, because my outputs, it's a bit of a weird way I've done this. Because I've not actually built the second half of the factory on this side yet, I'm balancing some of the product to go across onto that side. So this factory here sends the product under this underground onto this side of the belt, and this factory here. So these two factories put onto there, and these two factories put onto this one here that goes straight onto that belt and down. Now, if I just had everything going straight onto this belt here, you'd put in a situation where this belt is going to get choked up pretty quickly, and this product simply would not be able to fall onto. So even though you can produce a lot more product, the outputs don't allow for you to actually export those products into your main factory, onto the bus line. So that's the reason for me doing an underground here and having them on the outside. But you've still got a situation where only the outside of this four-way belt balancer or throughput of product, it's only the outer belts that are being used in this instance. So I've put, not really for the purposes of balancing across the belts, although some of that is achieved. I've mainly done it here for the purposes of clearing out these outer lines. And so what I've done here is I've simply set on the inserter, so back onto normal mode here, clicked on the inserter, and I've put an output priority to be on the left or right hand side. So just to put that into context, any product that comes into this belt balancer here, it's going to try and fill up this belt side first. So this side of the splitter first, which I'm then splitting across the two middle lanes using this splitter here. Okay, so these are essentially being balanced against each other, but I'm pushing the product onto the middle, which means that any of these factories down here would still be able to produce and actually export products onto this belt here. And the same applies on this side. So that's just another application of being able to condense across into the middle rather than one side or the other. This is probably not the most efficient. I did this quite a while ago. This is probably not the most efficient way of doing it, but on that same factory, I'm now going to split that product. And I've decided that I want 4 lanes of that product to go to the left and to the right, rather than splitting it 2 left and 2 right. Because you can do that. You can just have full output left and right. The problem is, if you're making 4 lanes worth of product and you've got maximum production, you're making 4 products worth of product, but you're then only sending 2 products worth of product in either direction, meaning the factories further down the line only have a maximum capability of using up 2 lanes worth of product. So if you're exporting or if you're outputting 4 lanes, you want to be making sure that your bus can actually utilize all 4 lanes like that. So what this does is it enables all of these lanes, all 4 lanes, to have product across all lines that way and all lines that way. You're welcome to copy that, but I'm sure there are probably more efficient ways of doing that. This isn't necessarily about balancing product across the lines, because I know my production is going to be high enough on that factory, and actually, as it happens, the demand of this product isn't that high either, so I know it will back up. And yeah, so this is mainly actually about making sure that the product is condensed across those lines equally. So what I don't want is this input line to start to run dry and to affect an output line if one of these other lines is not running dry. You want these other lines to be propping up a dry line when there is a dry line. For instance, if there's a factory up here that's slow for whatever reason, perhaps the inputs, maybe there's not enough wood in the factories on this side, it would slow up the production on one of the sides, meaning that actually, oh yeah, and by the way, this balance is 4 to 4, so it is quickly balanced first across all 4 lanes before it then balances left and right. So you can stack different belt balancers across each other to achieve what it is that you want to achieve. So that's an application of that. With the advent of the the filters and the input-output priorities. The way you use bus lanes and bus lines has changed quite a lot, I would say. So it used to be that you had to balance and pull product off. Well, now you can still pull off product, and I always choose to pull product off the top of my line, but I set the output priority to be to the right hand side. So these splitters are going to first take the inputs and push them all to the top. So I know that this line is going to be as condensed as possible. And I'm only doing that because I know I need a fully condensed product there. If I didn't need a fully condensed product, I'd probably just pull a splitter off there, and it wouldn't matter what output there would be of product, because perhaps it's a low demand factory that I'm making. But in this instance, this is I don't even know what factory this is. Splitter, yeah, I'm making splitters and belts and stuff like that. So I need that to be fully condensed. So I'm pulling all the product off there. Now the way I'm sort of rebalancing on the bus, now bear in mind there's a maximum throughput here on the copper line of 6 unloading bays, which are balanced from 3 to 2 on either side, meaning we're then left with a 4 to 4 balancer here. I've got a maximum throughput of 4 currently on that copper line. To find my wherever it was I was there, I think I was here. So the maximum throughput inputs onto that bus line is 4 full belts worth of product. Now, if I'm taking product here, I want to make sure that the absolute maximum capacity across the remaining 4 lines can then be hit. I don't want the fact that I've pulled product north for here to stagnate these other lines. I want them to be able to fully fill up again. So I've then put some belt balancers after this, which will then mean that these lines will fill up again. But I've then prioritized the outputs to be the top line again. So this means if this is fully utilized, this one belt of product, okay, so this factory's at full tilt and this copper is being fully utilized the whole time, you're theoretically left in a situation where among those 4 lines of product, the total quantity of product that's being used is one belt's worth. Now that product will be coming from all 4. If this top line's full, yeah, so it will come from all 4, but the output will mean that this bottom line is drained first, and then further on down the line, it will be the next line that will be drained first, and the next line. So it just makes things a little bit easier and a little bit more manageable if you apply those principles within your factory. So that's actually managing it on the bus line itself. So hopefully that's been useful. So I've done some applications. I've been balancing across multiple belts. Some drawbacks and limitations. There are some drawbacks and limitations to using belt balancers. So we just and I use the train lines as a pretty good example here. So sometimes in Factorio you need to make a distinction between what's efficient and also what just makes sense from a space point of view. You're constantly evaluating 3 or 4 different key factors: space, speed, efficiency, and probably a few other factors: your actual need, your demand, your production, that sort of thing. And also, of course, the resources that you have available to you on the map and technology and stuff like that. So now, the way that Factorio would naturally work here, because this product, I'm going to use this as an example, because this product is hitting this belt first, this theoretically, all things considered, theoretically, this cargo wagon would be fully utilized. Now, when that belt balance is in full tilt, it would use all of those lines equally, and these will ensure that does happen. But you'll sometimes find, because of purely due to proximity, that product is closer to there, that this might be utilized first. So we might be able to see it in action. No, we can't really see it in action there. So what you sometimes get is trains will unload. Some of the cargo wagons will unload a little bit more quickly than others, and some will say, well, that's a sign of bad design. You're not doing your belt balancing properly. It's not. It means that I've chosen here to save space and take that design rather than trying to balance. Because what I could do is send these belts together into a belt balancer up here, and then they're equal distance, and then send it onto the bus line. But the problem is that takes up a lot of extra space up here, and I'm just simply not willing to trade off the space for a slight inefficiency. But some people will go to the nth degree, and honestly, some people are like that, and that's totally fine. if you've got the space and your OCD and all the rest of it, you may want to make it so that the distances as well is a factor. So not just ratios, quantities and balancing across the belts, but also distance of those belt balancers among themselves to each other. So that can also make a bit of a difference. Sometimes the game does some funny things as well, where it'll skip some products, and I don't know why it does it. I think they've cleaned it up in most of the versions in the last year or so, but it used to be the case that you'd get some tearing. So if you find that you think you should have a fully condensed belt, but it's not fully condensing, and you know you've got a full production going into that single belt, as an example with a single belt, if you want to try updating your version, assuming that's not going to break your factory, that's a good thing that you can do at that point. So that's that. I'm now going to go into a little bit of information about some of the ones I've seen online, if I can find it. Yeah. So I would bear in mind this Wikipedia, Factorio Wikipedia, because this is quite useful in just getting the concept into your head. So there are some other people that have got some blueprints out there as well, and these are just the ones I've come across here. So Bilker's Belt Balancers, he's got a GitHub account where you can kind of get the 12 to 4s, 12 to 6s and so on. These look quite nice. They look quite, I would say, spread out. This one looks quite well balanced here. But I think this is instances where you've got like individual lanes. Let's say you had a bus and you had 4 lanes of 4 iron there. A way of balancing those 4 lanes of 4 among themselves. So that's, again, going to kind of a further degree. You may want a situation where you don't want one line of iron to run dry as the output when the other lines are backed up, and that's what this particular it's a sort of a 16 to a 16 would do. So it balances like bus lines against bus lines, so it's almost taking the single belt to belts across themselves to bus lines. So that's quite an interesting approach, actually, that I've already gone through that. So you could also just add some quite nice aesthetically pleasing stuff to it as well. I wanted to show this one because this is an 8 to 8 belt balancer, but it's wider than the one that I showed. People are always looking to get the same functionality into a smaller space. If space is an issue, just do some searches around on the internet and you'll find, I'm sure, some more condensed versions. The 8 to 8 version that I've got, for example, is about half the size of that, and it achieves the exact same thing, and it's been tested. So yeah, there's just a kind of a layout of some other ones that have been used. Again, a little bit wider. They're not as condensed as the ones that I use, but just give you some ideas. Single belts going in, 2 belts going in, and that's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Some examples. Another 66 lane balancer. I think this is also Bilker's as well, so it's just a more sort of nicer, cleaner layout. I like the way he's done these numbers as well. That's really nice design. Here is where a guy is. It looks like he's got 2 bus lanes of 6 inputs and outputting 3 lots of 4 bus lane outputs. So it may just be the case that he's got 2 quite major iron inputs and he wants them as 3 outputs rather than 2, which is fine. It might be that he's only got yellow belts. I don't know why I'm saying that because I can see the blue belts, but the yellow belts can only go a maximum of, I think, 4 distance in vanilla. So it may be the case that he can't actually send underground belts under that, so he's just transferring it to that. But clearly he has blue belts because that's what the blueprint is. I like this one. It's a really clean one. This is a 12 to a 12, but I also like the cement that he's done here as well. I'm not sure. It looks like these are just 2 versions of the same thing, but he's just balanced it by putting a gap there. So that's a 6 to a 6 and a 6 to a 6 built into a 12-12. And this is a really interesting one. It's a 32 to 32 balancers. They are available out there, and I think that's about as condensed as you can get it as well, actually. Like, someone's actually gone to the effort of making that. I mean, you must have a pretty serious mega base to be doing 32 to 32 belt balances, but fair enough. The reason why I wanted to show this one, though, is because there's... so I'll just credit this person, by the way. This is Stormcrow42. No thanks. But then there's also Dracunet here has got this picture, which just illustrates the way he's done the belt balancing of a 32 to 32. So he's done a 4 to 4 belt balancer, He's then inputted those 4 to 4s as an 8 to 8 balancer. That 8 to 8 has just been multiplied there by 2 to make a 16 to 16 balancer, and then he's taken that one and multiplied it by there. So you are able to condense the belt balancers into themselves. So it'll be good to see what sort of trial and error you guys can come up to. I had intended for this video to be like 20 minutes long, and as always it's been much longer than that, so I'm really sorry it's been as long as that. If if you've persevered this long, congratulations and thanks a lot for watching. If you found this content useful, please do feel free to subscribe and like the video, and yeah, happy belt balancing. Take care.